Hi, comrades. Thanks for joining us for a special session of the Communist Forum. We're discussing today Marxism and trans-liberation. It's not a debate, we should say from the outside. It's labeled as a discussion. There's far too little of it on the left, with the subject having cleaved apart quite a few organizations on the left, and having led to variations of the no platforming issue. As communists, I think we think that attitude is counterproductive. We want to openly discuss issues, especially contentious ones, and in the hope of overcoming divisions in our movement. Otherwise, the task of making revolution as a majority is becoming ever more difficult. We have linked to the invite today a couple of articles by Roxy Hall, 10 theses on the gender question, and Mike McNair's reply to it. We'll also link them again when we're sending out the video. This is not the first discussion we're going to have on the subject, and it won't be the last. And we'll carry on these discussions. Just for information, we're live streaming the introductions, but not the discussion. So we hope that comrades will feel that they can freely contribute and raise questions and any other issues they might have. So we're starting with Roxy Hall, who's going to speak for 25 to 30 minutes, then over to Mike, and then we're opening up to questions and comments from the floor. Over to you, Roxy. Thanks for joining.
Yes, and thank you very much for having me, comrades. It's quite late at night here. I'm in Australia, so thank you very much also for moving your regular scheduled time back a few hours so that I wasn't calling you at 3 in the morning, which I think I would be significantly less compos mentis if we had worked with the original time. I will try to be brief because I don't like to rattle on for too long. And I'll note that this so when I originally I was asked to speak on this a few months ago, after me and Mike had a bit of an exchange, but unfortunately they got postponed, so my talk has been updated a little bit since then. And what I really, and obviously the topic of Marxism and trans-liberation is very broad, and so when I asked, what specifically we should be talking about, we kind of came to the conclusion that the best thing for us to discuss would be how should Marxists orient towards the question of the trans rights movement and trans liberation as a political force in society. And I think that is a useful way of framing it, but I hope comrades will forgive me by beginning with some general analysis so that comrades can understand where I'm coming from in terms of my analysis of what we are talking about here. So obviously, when we talk about transgender people, we're talking about a specific group of people, but the theoretical questions that are raised by this movement are quite broad and sweeping, and so they obviously develop, and obviously there's a lot to be discussed in that regard. I don't want to linger too long, and I don't want to do a whole rehash of the Engels stuff, origins of the family. I'm going to treat you all with respect for your intelligence. I know that the comrades here are broadly quite familiar with a lot of that stuff. So but I want to kind of sort of set some parameters in how I'm thinking about this question. So firstly, the human species, as we know, is sexually bimodal. It's not perfectly dimorphous, but it is bimodal in the sense that there are two primary, there are two sort of modal points in terms of development of human sex, and human societies are divided by gender. This division is inherited from our evolutionary origins, but is not reducible to them, as the evolutionary psychologists would like to argue. The emergence of gender, as distinct from sex, is closely related to the emergence of human beings as cultural animals, and related to the emergence of totemism, ritual, abstract thought, that is, the birth of culture. Now, obviously, as human culture develops, this opens a new dialectical process, the first and only one of its kind to our knowledge, which is a process of social development, in which a dizzying myriad of social formations emerged since that time. Human sexual life, and closely related to that, the gender structures of a given society are not eternal or exist outside of culture. Rather, they are historically and culturally constituted in the development of social formations and various modes of production. Sexuality, human sexuality, is very closely linked to gender, both in gender relations of a given society and the particular forms of identity that develop from a given historico-social conjuncture. Just as the forms of sexual life in a given society are historically contingent, so are the various forms of sexual identity. In each form of society, the ruling sexual norms reflect the needs of the existing social order. I call this, or the term that I use for this is sexual hegemony. And I borrow this term from Christopher Chitty's quite excellent book, the same title, which I recommend everybody reads. I think that in order to frame my discussion, the sort of theoretical end of my argument, I want to talk about how I understand bourgeois sexual hegemony, i.e., the sexual norms that develop in the epoch of capitalist social development. I broadly distinguish two epochs of bourgeois sexual hegemony. This is obviously very broad, and I borrow this schema from Raimund Reicher in his book, Sexuality and the Class Struggle. On one hand, there is the ascendant period of the bourgeois. In this period, the dominant sexual norms of the bourgeois countries is that of sexual restraint, rigorous control of desire, and the virtues of self-denial. This produces a sexual conservatism which reaches its apogee in the period of Victorian values. This form of this sexual norm, or this form of sexual hegemony, is reflective of the problems confronting early capitalist society and the logic of the bourgeois class in this period. Anyone who has read someone like Adam Smith will know that early bourgeois intellectuals were constantly concerned with problems of excess, and thrift was considered a high virtue amongst the early bourgeois class. In the logic of the early modern state, the emerging capitalist states, the ability to regulate sexuality, the so-called passions of men, was the ability to regulate social life itself. Once again, Christopher Chitty's book, Sexual Hegemony, is very good on this. He discusses the way that regimes of sexual regulation emerged in places like Florence, the Low Countries, and in Britain as part of the bourgeois revolutions of this period. The second period of bourgeois sexual hegemony corresponds broadly to the epoch of mass consumption in the advanced capitalist states. In these societies where the working class had been incorporated into bourgeois society through the socialization of the wage relation, bourgeois culture reoriented towards overcoming barriers to consumption, that is, the realization of surplus value. This unleashes a totally new form of cultural life, which emphasizes indulgence, consumption, and immediacy. The buy now, pay later culture of the post-war boom and going into our contemporary period is totally alien to the culture of thrift and self-reliance that is so emphasized in early bourgeois society. And it is in this context of a crisis in the previous sexual hegemony and the emergence of a new sexual hegemony that we get the emergence of gay liberation and the transgender identity, what we understand as transgender people. So transgender identity is historically contingent. That's something that I want to emphasize Obviously, and this is true of many transgender people in the trans movement, there is a tendency to project identities backwards and forwards in time, a universalizing factor. But I do believe we should be ruthlessly historicist in all things. So, in particular, transgender identity reflects the forms of sexual identity that have developed in industrial capitalist societies. Like homosexual identity, it borrows its language from the medical discourses of sexology. Its exact path of development is complex. Transgender identity emerges first in terms of originally using the term transsexuality, which is a word imported to English from German sexological discourses. As a term, the group of people that today call themselves transgender emerged as a subset of the gay scene that had developed in the sort of 60s in the great cities of the advanced capitalist countries. It was rooted in a prior cultural scene that was that of cross-dressing, which had long predated it and had deep roots in working class culture and the sexual scene of young working men in the industrial cities. As a term, transgenderism, like transsexual, is a loan word from bourgeois sexological sources. In particular, the term was coined for a book on sexual hygiene and pathologies. And I think the reason I'm emphasizing this is something I want to come back to later. The terminology that these identity categories sort of develop from are formed within the bourgeois medical institutions. With the emergence of gay liberation, the history of which is very rich and worth studying, but I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail with, there was quickly attempts to address the conditions of transvestites, transsexuals, and related groups of people. The liberation of the quote-unquote queens quickly took on its own organizational forms and sets of political demands. And there's a bunch of really rich documents and stuff from this time period. By 1970, across the United States, there were several transvestite and transsexual organizations. Transvestite Transsexual Action Organization, the Coquettes in San Francisco, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries in New York, Femmes Against Sexism, Transvestites and Transsexuals, Radical Queens formed in Milwaukee, and the formation of the Queens Liberation Front. All of the transvesticism, transsexualism, homosexuality were seen as related, but increasingly understood as somewhat separate, somewhat tied together notions. We noted that this is also included in many in the non-specific manifestos of this time period. I have in front of me a copy of the 16-point platform and program of the Third World Gay Revolution Group, which was drafted in 1970, which includes as part of its demands is the right to physiological change and sex changes as part of their broad program of gay liberation and anti-imperialism. So we have this emerging identity that is developing in the context of gay liberation. And the argument that I want to make is that what makes gay liberation subversive, I won't use the term revolutionary because I think it's a bit loaded, but subversive, was that it challenged the sexual hegemony of the bourgeois in an epoch where the existing sexually conservative social order was entering a prolonged crisis. However, absent a broader social revolution, the gay liberation was, within the coming decades, its radical wing was defeated and it was integrated politically within the rainbow coalition of left-wing neoliberalism. Alongside the advancement of ethnic minorities, through the rubric of multiculturalism, again, the advancement of women through liberal feminism, homosexuals would be slowly integrated into the norms of bourgeois society through the left wing of the neoliberal project. It is this process of liberalization which sees the formalization and increasing reification of transgender identity. This is because within the framework of what I call rainbow coalition neoliberalism, identity groups are seen as specific interest groups whose needs are mediated by the liberal state, and who have community leaders who represent them. This is very important to the kind of form of social management that is pioneered in the context of neoliberalism. The contemporary transgender movement, it's different in different countries, as with the rest of the LGBT movement, which broadly sort of exists in most advanced capitalist countries, is an outgrowth of this process of domestication and integration of gay liberation into sort of acceptable bourgeois politics. Even its radical forms, which are today associated with the sort of semi-anarchist, radical liberal scene and in the youth culture, don't really break away from this dominant logic. So where does that put us? I think we confront a political problem. The dominant problems of politics of the trans movement, which is still largely connected to the broader LGBT movement, is the defense of liberal norms against reaction. I think this is extremely true in this contemporary moment. A huge amount of energy is being spent mobilizing gay and trans people, especially young gay and trans people, in a defense of liberal norms and liberal institutions. Socialists largely tail this movement because they do not have an alternative political program on the question of gay liberation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. This systematic defense of institutional liberalism has ultimately weakened the gay movement and led it into a political blind alley. Gay and trans rights are now associated with a hated political establishment and with the project of liberal multilateral imperialism. It is my view that while gay and trans oppression still exists, very obviously so, the movement is no longer subversive from the standpoint of capitalist development. Though I will also say that we are living in a period of transformation in the dominant means by which capitalism is being managed, and this could change. It's not eternal or set in stone. So what then is the Marxist orientation? It is my view that socialists have largely tailed the liberal state in its embrace of an identitarian, medical, sociological LGBT identity. This is not to say that I think we should wag our fingers at people for identifying as this or that. I don't really think that's useful. It is just that I do not think a politics rooted in these identity claims are overly useful for communists. Instead, Marxists should see the liberation of transgender people as a natural part of our broader proletarian socialist program. The organization of the working class into a class party, the establishment of a proletarian democracy, the socialization of the economy, international revolution, the socialization of domestic labor, the abolition of the family, sexual freedom, personal freedom, political and democratic rights. All of these core programmatic tasks are entirely necessary to allow all people to live free and meaningful lives. Rather than a single issue orientation, as many trans activists have, or an intersectional coalition orientation, Marxists should see the liberation of transgender people as being bound up with the freedom of gays and lesbians, the freedom of women, the emancipation of children. I want to give an example from my own context, comrades, that might help clarify how different approaches to this question. So in my state, I live in Queensland, the Conservative state government under the Liberal National Party has just introduced a ban on accessing trans healthcare for teenagers, people under the age of 18. And the movement has sprung up in criticizing this decision. And we, my own organization, I'm a member of the Revolutionary Communist Organization, have entered into this kind of movement, but we wanted to raise a particular question. The main line of the movement is framed as protecting trans kids. This is kind of the main line of the movement. People in Britain would obviously be familiar with this. And the language that's utilized is overwhelmingly that doctors and parents know what they're doing and that they have the right to seek the proper medical care for their children without the interference of the state. We think that this is a conservative orientation, and rather that our basic political demand should be that young people, transgender or otherwise, should have informed bodily autonomy and support for whatever medical condition they seek out. This is a basic democratic demand, and it links the struggles of trans kids for example, the struggle of young women to access contraception and abortion. Of course, this does not mean we should ignore gay issues and trans issues as they arise. When addressing the LGBT movement, we should do so on two bases, in my view. Firstly, we should organize gay and trans workers and youth in defense of their own political, democratic, social, and economic freedoms. And secondly, we should seek to integrate gay and trans workers into the workers' movement and the proletarian movement, as we would when engaging with the conditions of women, for example, for the women's department, etc. I don't favor a federalist or intersectionalist schema when dealing with this. I think that a robust democratic political life is the best way to deal with internal differences on these questions. But in terms of the outward work of a mass party, the question is, how do we best organize specific layers of the working class? That is the end of my notes. I hope comrades followed that and found it somewhat useful. Yeah, I eagerly await people's questions. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Neither intersectional nor single issue. That's, I think, a very good point. Mike, if you could switch your camera on now so I can bring you in. And after that, we can open up for question and comments.
Okay. Thanks for that, Roxy. I'm going to be talking slightly at a tangent to this. I think there are two issues involved which have different logical implications, or not different implications, one of which is programmatic issues and the questions, and the other is theoretical questions. We will debate the theoretical questions and we'll probably continue to debate the theoretical questions into the fairly distant future, because just for example, the question of materialism versus idealism, it goes back to Plato versus Democritus and Epicurus. Within Marxism, there are different views of the woman question. In Engels, Babel, Zetkin, Kollontai, at least between 140 and 100 years ago, and they likely to be continue to be debated. The second is the issues of programmatic questions. And in relation to the programmatic questions, what we have to say about programmatic questions has to address itself to the near future. I'm not going to say the present, because I don't believe in the existence of the present. There is only the projections forward of the near future, which we make on the basis of the near past. Address itself to the near future, though it addresses itself to the near future as far as the maximum program at least is concerned, in terms of orienting to orienting the near future in terms of the considerably more distant future. So going in my second issue to programmatic questions, in relation to the maximum program, the point of the maximum program at the end of the day is the possibility of human emancipation, or put another way, of a society whose aim is the maximization of human possibilities. And this embrace of the maximization of human possibilities carries with it the embrace of the possibility of full bodily autonomy, access to transition as a medical regime, whatever. Medical regime is ambiguous, but transition provisions of one sort and another. And here, in my view, both the Marxist Unity Group's perspective line on this statement on this question and Comrade Roxy's theses are broadly sound. and that, it seems to me, so the question of trans in the maximum program, it seems to me the answer is it's fairly straightforward. Second point in relation to the maximum program, if we ask about what are the underlying dynamics which in the society of the current, in the recent past have, and in the near future will continue to produce the queer bashing of trans and killing of trans people, and also actually of gay men and lesbians, though that of gay men and lesbians has become less frequent than it was in the past, and what leads to the existence of broad mass support for far-right witch hunting. In my view, although this may sound like a theoretical point, I think it actually has, this is a theoretical point which actually has immediate programmatic implications. This grows out of the dynamics of family formation in market society, because the dynamics of family formation in market society, beginning in late Middle Ages and continuing right down to the present, involve the disappearance of the arranged marriage system, and in consequence the replacement of the arranged marriage system, which is characteristic of pre-modern societies, with a marriage marketplace, or sexual marketplace, market dynamics of the formation of families. And these market dynamics of the formation of families carry with them both mass anxiety about the sexuality, reproductive potential, etc., of the children of parents, and the performance of heterosexual masculinity, which takes the form of one of various forms of the performance of heterosexual masculinity, but one of the forms of performance of heterosexual masculinity is queer bashing. And the consequence of that is that until we see a transition beyond market society, not just a transition beyond capitalist political rule, but a transition beyond market society, those dynamics will tend to reassert themselves. Same for slightly different reasons. There is also an engine of the oppression of trans people, which is in fact also an engine of the oppression of women, of the oppression of lesbians and gay men, of the oppression of racial minorities, etc., which is the bureaucratic coercive state, considered as merely as a bureaucratic coercive state. And here again, in fact, in this case, we've got the clearest possible evidence in the form of the Soviet and analogous regimes that the interest of the state bureaucracy in the maintenance of its power as a state bureaucracy, in the regulation and control of those below it, creates the mills which grind the faces of the poor in welfare law, and which also grind the faces of minority groups of one sort and another. So that again, the transition beyond the supersession of the state, the withering away of the state, the transition beyond the state is indispensable to overcoming the oppression of trans people, as well as of many other people. So the consequence of that is that actually, if we as communists were to promise that we can overcome the oppression of trans people, short of the overcoming of not merely capitalism, but class society, the overcoming of class society and communism, actually we would be promising what we can't deliver. Secondly, if we come to the turning to the minimum program, I have argued that the minimum program should, by design, aim at drawing out the common experience and common elements of oppression as between class, race, sex, gender, and so on. And that common that was the method which was reflected in Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners, which, okay, that Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners was as successful as it was, and that was the turning point, and it was historically the turning point between a general culture of lesbians and gay men are threatening, etc., to a general culture of it's more or less it's okay. That grew out of identifying the commonality of the experience of particularly gay men, of their clubs being raided by the cops, and on the other hand of the strikers, of their pickets being attacked by the cops. So the minimum program, therefore, in terms of the program of the party, should be trying to draw out what's common across the various different experiences, and as that as being a method of approach. I add equally that the question of access to medical services, this is a general question. Even the question of doctors playing the role of gatekeepers for conservative and Christianist politics. Doctors playing the role of gatekeepers for conservative and Christianist politics is not only a problem which affects trans people in seeking gender care in this respect. It's actually a problem which affects women in general, and indeed it affects women in very much larger numbers. So that there's a common issue about having a public health service, which right now we are facing attacks on the National Health Service in this country, which have been prepared by a prolonged process of starvation for assets and fraudulent misrepresentations by the popular press, by the advertising-funded press. Well, it's not just in this country, it's also in France. The public subsidy to the public-private system is being cut down. We can't afford, etc. This is all preparatory to, for us, the Trump administration is demanding the right to buy up parts of the NHS for an American-style private healthcare system. These are common. These are things which are common, but it's also the case, as I said, that having the problem of Christianist and conservative doctors and nurses and so on is equally a problem for many people beyond trans people. Nonetheless, I think there is a case for the creation of a set of, well, I think there's certainly a case with writing down a set of theses on the issue of a specific theses on the issue of trans, in the same way as we CPGB have written down in the past a set of theses on Israel Palestine, a set of theses on Ireland, etc., around this specific issue about how this issue connects into our general program, and saying in this much more than we ought to be saying in our general program. In our general program, I add, in our discussions with our fusion discussions in forging communist unity, one of the issues which was raised last week was that the CPGB's draft program is too long, and the CPGB comrades say we recognise that it is longer than we would wish it to be, but we're not clear that we can be reduced much more. We certainly don't want to extend it substantially further. Second side The minimum programme approach, as I said, needs to point in the direction of solidarity. And in this context, the point is to win the support. Roxy's helpfully made the point, find the piece of paper. Oh, that the human species is bimodal rather than strictly dimorphous. And I think that's an important point. It's an important point because we look at the situation. Roughly 85% of people, roughly, are heterosexual male fertile or heterosexual female fertile. 15% of people are, for one or another reason, physically infertile. And then within the 15%, there are smaller groups who are equally there are smaller groups who are lesbian or gay, who are trans, who are etc. 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 Our object in this is the self-emancipation of humanity in general implies actually that we are for the emancipation of the 85% and not just of the minority groups, and that we are seeking to win that large majority to support for the liberation of trans people, and not simply that we're not seeking the dictatorship of the minority over the majority. And in fact, the rights agenda, the liberal rights agenda here, I think again there's an agreement between myself and Comrade Roxy. The liberal rights agenda carries with it the argument for the dictatorship of the minority over the majority. And that was already the case when it was being argued, the liberal rights agenda, when it was being argued by John Rawls and Ronald Dworkin in the middle 1970s. This was part of the same process as the Carter administration's human rights agenda. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the rollback, the turn from containment of communism to rollback of communism. In that context, I've argued, and I'm not clear whether this is a difference or not, but that the legal the model of legal gender recognition, in which certainly was taken by the British government, you could identify either as male or as female, and then you were going to be allowed to change your identification simply like that, is a model which precisely defines round that it has to be dimorphous, not bimodal. And which we've now got the extreme version of that in Donald Trump's legislation, that every person is either male or female depending on XX or XY as of conception, which is in fact not determinable at conception, but we can imagine that he rewrote the legislation so that it said XXXY from the moment at which it's determined. Which is in essence legislation to impose the rule in Genesis, male and female, God created the person, male and female created he them, as a rule of law. But that was already there in the in the gender recognition legislation, and there in the gender recognition legislation in a way which meant that it could be attacked. It was an exposed salient. In this context, the so-called gender critical feminist, or so-called TERF, trans exclusionary radical feminist position, with the backing of the Conservative Republicans, and then of the Conservative Republicans' tails in the Tory party and some other right-wing parties, mutated into Tory feminism, of the sort of Aphra Behn in the 1670s to 1680s, Della River Manley in the 1700s, Hannah More around 1800, or Emmeline Pankhurst during and after 1914. Tory feminism, which is an ally of the far right. In spite of that reality that this is an ally of the far right, the actual policy of no platforming TERFs, which we started having the fight about in this organisation, and which we had the fight about with comrades on the British left at considerable length, is also the policy of no platforming racists serves to give political support to the Labour bureaucracy, as in the Unison Monkey trial in 2009, where opponents of the Unison right wing bureaucratic leadership were accused of racism for using the three wise monkeys image. And more recently, and more spectacularly, serves to give political support to the anti-Semitism witch hunt, which insists on making any opponent of the Israeli settler colonial state into a, quote, racist, and therefore to be under no platform for racists, or for that matter, to be no platformed under, quote, safe spaces policies and legislation. So this stuff is, in terms of elements of the minimum program, that is as essential to the minimum program as any particular issue or particular demand which we should raise for transliberation in the minimum program. We can't, it's totally fails if we try and organize on the basis of no policy on the basis of no platforming. Theory, I'm just going to observe en passant. I think this is just me. I think that it is theoretically necessary to have understandings of consistency in order to have understandings of historical change. Because if one separates radically period A from period B, actually the radical separation of period A from period B means you can't actually see what's changed. That was already very visible in Althusser Balibar's book, Reading Capital, that the structures radically separated from each other prevent there being any sense of how the process of change takes place, or what indeed is a process of change. In that sense, my own, for what it's worth, I think it's necessary to recognize that the regulation of gender is not just as a remote level. There's Comrade Roxy is correct. The regulation of gender as distinct from biological sex is part of what makes us human, and which the radical anthropology group authors have usefully made off. But it's also the case that the regulation of gender in the interests of class superiority is something which is common if we look at Mesopotamian and Greek and Roman antiquity, and feudal society and capitalism, and is common actually as well if we look at pre-revolutionary Chinese society. And of course, pre-revolutionary Chinese society refers to a succession of dynastic regimes going back to the Han, which is the first of which we have serious hard evidence of its social regime in the around immediately around what's BC to AD, late BC to early AD in Western. But equally of the Sasanian regime, which again is the first of which we have significant evidence to be able to make such statements, because all we know about the Achaemenid regime is pretty much all we know about the Achaemenid regime is what the Greeks thought about it, and so on. So that just that understanding that this issue of the regulation of gender as a means of class, class control and holding the lower orders in subordination is something which extends over the prolonged period. But then what moves into the capitalist order is new. And then we can see that the capitalist order, because it's a market order, but also because it's a state order, requires higher levels of well, it on the one hand, it creates the opportunities of subcultures in a way which don't exist prior. On the other hand, it intensifies the intervention of the state and the level of the state bureaucracy as a policing agency. And in that sense, that the emergence of capitalism then as such creates the present regime. So here I come to a point where I think, in difference with Comrade Roxy. I think the subculture, the gay subculture, not gay male subculture, not necessarily lesbian subculture. I'd be less clear about that, but it's an evidence question. Emerges in late medieval Venice, in late 17th century Netherlands, in late 17th, early 18th century England. That subculture is actually quite strongly associated with cross-dressing, but it's cross-dressing with a view to sexual signaling. I dress as in drag in order to say that I'm available for sex with men, or vice versa. A woman dresses that again less because women dress as men in order to access opportunities which don't exist for women. But we certainly have cases of women who dress as men in order to signal availability for sex with women. I think, accept the idea of an early bourgeois, non-consumerist early bourgeois society. There's been quite a lot of work done by historians on consumerism in 17th century Netherlands and in 18th century Britain. The argument for private vices, public virtues, for the merits of consumerism as giving rise is made by Mandeville in The Fable of the Bees in 1713. So in that sense, to be historicist, there's a danger of being over-historicist. Flip side of this, trans grows out of the gay liberation movement, yes, in a sense, but in a sense partly because Jamie Gough wrote in Simon Shepherd and Mick Wallace's book, Coming On Strong, about the masculinization of the gay subculture in the 1970s and into the 1980s. And while it's true that part of that is respectabilization, incorporation into the regime, part of it is a shift into more explicit fetishism of the male homosexual identity as involving fetishism of the male body. Yes, the result is part of in the identity politics of groups incorporated into the liberal state. That, of course, is also a policy of Eurocommunism as a political tendency, and it's the arguments of Eurocommunism in favor of the adoption by the left of what was already, in a sense, the view of American positive political science in the 1960s, that the liberal state balances the interests of a whole mass of different and separable subgroups. But of course, the result of that policy is that the left abandons class, and with the left abandoning class in favor of intersectionality, class does not the salience of class as politics does not disappear, contrary to the idea of the Euro-communists, and for that matter of the Euro-Trotskyists, the Mandelites and others who deprioritize class. On the contrary, what happens is that class resurfaces as a central element of the politics of the far right, and the left, quote, elites, unquote, who become targeted by the far right. Why? It's not the liberals imagine that the far right, the right and the far right have been killed. This is progress, etc., etc. The reality is that the politics of the right resurfaces uh, because the regime of capitalism is both a regime of the free market, which promotes liberalism, and a regime of the factory, starting with the wind-driven factories which sailed the seas of late medieval and early modern Europe, um, and the radical subordination of the factory. And at the same time, it's also the case that the claim that markets tend to equilibrium is merely false, and that because the claim that markets tend to equilibrium is merely false, the result is that markets necessarily entail the other, both at one end, which is the state, the regulatory state, becomes much stronger under capitalism, and again already in 18th century England. And the other side of it is that the market means that the family is the necessary alternative to it. There are no longer monasteries, whether Christian or Buddhist, and other forms of religious community. There are fewer places outside of the market. Indeed, the more society, the more the liberals insist on marketization, the more they throw up nationalist collectivism, religious collectivism, and the family, the dependence on the family and familyist collectivism, with the result that we wind up with the regime of the witch hunts, of which Roxy has just described what's going on in Queensland, ban on trans healthcare for teenagers, but equally in relation to what's been done in this country over the witch hunt against the Scottish National Party, the witch hunt against the Tavistock Portman Clinic, and the Trumpites' new legislation. So these are, I'm not going to any great length in the history because we're running short. I'm short of time, and in any case, it's hopefully what I've had to say will be slightly more productive, well, be reasonably productive and not merely dragging on. That's it.
Thanks very much, Mike. Roxy would like to come in briefly.
Yeah, I just realized that I didn't actually address the sort of question of transphobic feminism and, whatever we want to call this political tendency or political tendencies. I personally don't like the term TERF because I think that most of the people that gets leveled at aren't actually radical feminists, but I guess it didn't really, like, when I was first invited to speak on the topic, that wasn't immediately an issue that stood out to me because, to put it pretty simply, that tendency is very small in Australia, and there just isn't all that many of them, and they're not really politically relevant. And in fact, most of our major ones all got exported to the UK, like Germaine Greer and stuff, so they all left, and we don't really have to deal with them anymore. I think that that it's worth exploring a somewhat of a materialist account of why this why this movement, why this particular form of anti-trans sentiment became so predominant in Britain in particular. I think that it has something to do with the sort of a generation of second wave feminists who were elevated into the sort of culture industry, sort of ideological state apparatus in a way that didn't happen in Australia or the US. But also there's other, I think there's I think it was Anne made a good point in the Weekly Worker Discord server about sectional interests that I think is very important here as well. I think my view on the matter is that we need to seek that the primary, at this point, this tendency has passed its sort of zenith and has been largely folded into the new right, the contemporary right, and I think that we've seen that they've been essentially politically subordinated to the likes of Matt Walsh and the real like Christian reactionary crowd. I think that ultimately the effects of this political program have been effectively splitting and massively weakening the women's movement in a lot of countries. In my own city, there's two competing International Women's Day committees, one of which excludes transgender people and the other one which doesn't. And the group that excludes transgender people have not campaigned on any issue besides the trans issue in about a decade now. I think that primary accusation I would level at these tendencies is that their function has been that of splitting and wrecking an already weakened women's liberation movement in a lot of countries, and then politically making a alliance and fully subordinating themselves to the new right. Yes, so that's just what I have to say on that matter.
Thank you, comrade. If anybody has any questions or comments, please raise your hand or put it in the chat if you can't find your raise hand button. Roxy, while I got you there, can I ask you a question, and that hopefully Mike can talk about as well briefly? Rereading your 10 theses and Mike's reply to it as well in preparation for this meeting, there's a certain difference of opinion as well on the question of the future of gender. I think I detected there. You were explaining in your article that, the question of womanhood is very much tied to capitalism and, tying the woman to the house, to traditional gender roles, etc. And you are in favor of overcoming womanhood, I think as you put it in your 10 theses, whereas Mike was more talking about, abolishing gender hierarchy. He thought you would be more into abolishing gender in a communist society. Could I have your view on this a little bit? And comrades, please click raise hand if you want to come in.
Yeah, so I think that in my article, I definitely put forward a gender abolitionist viewpoint, and I still hold to the broad outline of that. I do think that, what we understand as womanhood is shaped by an entire ideological structure of heteropatriarchal social relations, which go long before the development of capitalism, but into the history of the development of the family. Obviously, Mike talked about a lot of that, and I find that history very interesting. I think that there's something that we need to, when it comes to, so let me just grab my thoughts. I think that in overcoming this this particular transformation, we overcome this particular structure. We overcome so much of what it means to talk about womanhood, etc., that I feel that to go beyond that is in many ways pure speculation. I don't really have much to say on the matter besides I'm sure the people who lived through that historical epoch will find it all very exciting. I think that so I think that really, if we call it gender abolition, or if we talk about abolishing gendered hierarchies, abolishing the heteronormative social order, etc., I think that what we're really talking about is the emancipation of women and the emancipation of human sexuality and expression from the domination of these social systems which regulate the libidinal structures of human life for the benefit of power. I hope that makes some kind of sense.
Thank you. Mike, I wonder if you want to say something on that, because that's one of the few issues that you disagreed with with Roxy in her article.
It was the formulation. It seems to me actually that what Roxy has just said is not actually so different from what my view would be. I'm for the abolition of gender hierarchy. As to whether that means the abolition of gender in the sense of that humans are bimodal, I am not going to, because it's perfectly possible. This is we're moving into science fiction. Yeah, I read a lot of science fiction. Yeah. One of the things which is constantly comes up as a trope in science fiction is humans in the next century upload themselves into become software floating in an internet. I don't know that I'm not going to say that that's an excluded possibility. Sort of Ursula Le Guin's Always Coming Home has a peculiar world in which there's a very traditional society of humans living as ecologically okay in a ferociously degraded environment. And on the other hand, the city of mind, which is IT, AI, and artificial intelligence run explorers across the world, across the universe, across the solar system and beyond. Ken MacLeod's Cassini division, the guys who've uploaded themselves and become software have become an enemy of the biological humans in again, all of these things. So I'm not going to, I think we need to overcome the system of gender hierarchy. Overcoming the system of gender hierarchy is certainly going to involve transformative social relations. I think I quoted in one of the articles the barrister in Olive and Ingram who says women aren't allowed to wear breeches, but we shouldn't take their petticoats away from them. With the issue being whether a woman can be a parish official called a sexton. That's such a weird, from the modern point of view, for somebody to say women aren't allowed to wear trousers is a sort of weird statement. Mm. For my parents' generation, actually, it wouldn't have been a particularly weird statement. And that sort of transition, that level of change, it seems to me, that's a very superficial example, but it's a very curious one, actually, that women aren't allowed to wear. Nobody would now say women aren't allowed to wear trousers. It's a ridiculous idea. But the men aren't allowed to wear dresses is not quite so obvious in terms of heteronormative political culture. So it's a sort of, is that helpful?